Chapter 7. Tabitha's eyes widened, and she placed her hands on her hips. A shortcut, the noblewoman said in disbelief. But I thought I'd surveyed practically every map I had. I didn't see any shortcuts. Sally threw her head back and laughed. A map, the innkeeper squeaked through laughs. Oh, Tabitha, sometimes you really make me laugh. My family has lived in Yerrick for generations, and I can confidently say that there are some routes that no map will ever show. I felt a smile creep across my face. This was the exact help that we needed for this quest. Well then, I guess it's a good thing we came here first, Tabitha replied. Now spill. I want the details of the entire route. Anything for my Tabitha, Sally said. But what about if I told you over a mug of mead and some pie? Does that sound a little better? The mention of pie made me aware of how hungry I was. In fact, the more I thought about it, my stomach felt like a bottomless pit. That potion that Sybil had given me had wiped through any energy reserves that I had, and now I felt like I could eat an entire cow. That would be amazing, I said. Yeah, Sybil agreed. I would like nothing better. Well then, Sally smiled. Sit down at one of the tables and I'll bring you over some mead. Tabitha gestured for us to follow her to one of the tables near the bar. I sat down on a long wooden bench that felt like it had been there for hundreds of years while the girls sat across from me in a booth carved into the wall. Ah, Tabitha sighed. My home away from home. I looked out of the round window to my right and saw that the sun was almost completely set. These autumn days were incredibly short in Lupercalia, and there was less and less daylight as the weeks wore on. Tabitha had told me that some days in November only had 5 hours of sunlight, but I wasn't ready to believe that yet. I vowed to myself that those dark days would be the days we spent at our swanky new pad in New Jersey. I couldn't wait to sign the documents and have the place as my own. I'd have to turn my attention to my new place after this quest, but for now I had the King of Lupercalia to protect. I was snapped out of my ruminations by a heavy mug of mead as it thunked against the table. I looked down and saw a metal mug brimming with spicy, bubbly liquid, but before I could say thank you, the innkeeper was already hurrying toward the fireplace. That's a new recipe, Sally announced as she removed 3 fresh pies from the big cast-iron oven with a long spatula. I looked over at Tabitha, who was taking a massive swig of the stuff. The mug looked enormous in her hands, and she had to hold it with both fists just so she could lift it to her mouth. The blonde purred and wiped it off of her chin. This new recipe is amazing. What's in it? Sally pottered over with a plate of 3 individual pies and set them on the table. Cloves and cinnamon, of course. Sally huffed and removed her oven mitts. Just the spices for a chilly autumn day. And what about the pies? Sybil asked. By the goddess, they smell like heaven. She wasn't wrong, and I noticed that all 3 of us had leaned in closer to the pies so we could inhale the wonderful aroma. One of my specialties, the innkeeper chuckled. Sausage, squash, and sage. And a little bit of spinach in there too to make your bones strong. She retreated behind the bar for a moment and then reappeared with cutlery, which she brought to the table as well. Thank you so much, Sybil said as she jabbed a spoon into the crust. This is a feast. Oh, it's really no trouble. Sally waved her hand in the air. Anything for my Tabitha. And of course anything for an eternal protector of the kingdom. And even better, anything for a caring young lass like you who is going out of her way to help a family member in their time of need. Sybil blushed, and I saw Tabitha shoot her a mischievous look. Won't you pull up a chair? Tabitha asked in a polite bid to get her to tell us about the shortcut. Oh, of course, Sally said. By the way, be careful with those. They're hot. I looked over at Sybil, who was washing down a scorching hot mouthful of pie with her mead. Yes, the witch croaked. Very hot, but very good. Sally made her way around the table and plopped herself down comfortably next to me. Now, she said, and tapped on her chin with her right hand. There is an island on Lake Gomel, and it's just on the outskirts of Yerrick. You're going to want to go north for about 2 miles before you start going west, she said. Tabitha nodded eagerly, and I could see her mentally taking note. She was incredibly good at remembering directions and had the kind of topographic mind that any military commander would have killed for. 2 miles north makes sense, she repeated back. It's not an inhabited area, Sally pointed out, so if you run into any Towns, you veered slightly off course. It's not the end of the world, but it's not the fastest route either. Do you know about the purple distraction? Tabitha and Sybil looked at each other and then back at Sally Ann, completely dumbfounded. Sorry, Tabitha said. Did you just say the purple distraction? It sounded like a missing B-side from the Beatles' Magical Mystery Tour. But I'd heard weirder things in Lupercalia, so I just shrugged and decided to listen to whatever Sally Ann had to tell us. She trailed off. It's marked on most maps as an area of dense forest. Wait, Tabitha said. It wouldn't happen to be near the Black Country Passage. That leads us out of Yerrick. That's precisely where it is, Sally Ann smiled. But I thought that you couldn't even get through there, Tabitha said in a confused voice. I thought that it was completely overgrown. Several mapmakers would like to have you think that, Sally Ann explained. But it's not the dense thicket that they're making it out to be. Actually lavender fields. So it's real, Sybil gasped as her eyes lit up. Sally Ann nodded. It's behind a wall of old thick pine trees, so people tend to avoid it or change their route. But once you're through the pine trees, you'll come to a field of lavender. That means you're out of Yerrick and into the West Country. If you keep going west, you'll come to the end of the lavender fields, and just beyond that you will have reached the bank of Gomel. I've got it, Tabitha said. And it takes you straight to the lake? Exactly, Sally Ann said. The largest island in the lake is there as well. Just on the other side of the water, though you might want to avoid that. They say there's some mean old man who lives out there and he really hates visitors. Oh, unless that's your family member. Doesn't sound like him, Sybil assured the innkeeper. This is great, I said. If we make good time tomorrow, we could even try and get there before lunchtime. Lunchtime? Sally Ann laughed. That's a bit ambitious. Oh, he's fast, Sybil purred and stroked my leg with her foot under the table. I knew I'd have to drink another swig of that disgusting brew to make it by midday, but by God, did that stuff work. I took a sip of the spiced mead and let myself sink into a kind of tired stupor. The fire, the mead, and the girls chattering almost made me forget the grave conditions under which we were taking this quest. For now, I just felt grateful to be in such good company. I took my spoon, plunged it into my pie, and then I scooped out the delicious insides and took a big gulp. Sally Ann, I said between mouthfuls, this pie is so good. Don't speak with your mouth full, she laughed. And thank you. It's my grandmother's recipe. I finished off the rest of my pie in silence, right down to the last little crumb. When the plate was spotless, I sighed and slugged back more mead. Can I have another glass of mead? Tabitha asked when she was done. Of course, Sally Ann replied as she scooped up the noblewoman's mug. You are not allowed to be hungover tomorrow, Sybil hissed at Tabitha. Oh, don't be silly, Tabitha scoffed. I just want something to wash down my pie with. You already finished your pie, Sybil pointed out. But I don't want to have that taste in my mouth all night, Tabitha said. Sybil rolled her eyes and then looked to me for support. Honestly, I would have been happy to stay in the pub and drink mead all night. But Sybil had a point. Our mission was too important to risk getting drunk. One more, but that's it, I said. We'll want to set out early tomorrow. Oh yes, Sally Ann said as she rejoined us. The matter of rooms. Basically, we're making some changes upstairs, so I'm afraid that the attic room is full of furniture right now. However, I have a bedroom with 3 single beds on the first level that's available, if that suits you all. I looked back at the girls, who shrugged. Sounds fine to me, I said. Perfect, Sally Ann smiled. She cleared away our plates, and we swigged the last of our mead. The day's hard pace started to catch up with us, and all 3 of us yawned as the innkeeper cleared away the plates. I think I could hit the hay pretty soon, Sybil announced. Oh, already? Sally Ann asked quietly. I was hoping. Suddenly Sybil perked up. Oh, the witch said and smiled at the innkeeper, but not without a little lullaby to send us off. It wouldn't be right. Sybil rummaged through her basket and pulled out her wooden flute, much to the delight of the innkeeper. Oh, wonderful, Sally Ann cooed as she sat down beside me on the bench. I love a little music in the evening. Is there a song you'd like to hear? Sybil asked. Oh, let's see, Sally Ann mused as she tapped her chin. Well, if we want a lullaby, why not the one about the sleepy black dog? I haven't been able to get it out of my head since the last time you were here with that puppy of yours. Casanova, Tabitha replied and laughed. Sally Ann, you wouldn't believe how big he is now. He's practically as big as this table. She pounded her fist on the table and let out a dry laugh. I'd seen her father do the same thing at their dinner table in the palace, and the thought of how similar she was to old Blueclaw made me laugh. That cute little thing? Sally Ann chuckled. Well, you'll have to bring him along next time, because I just don't believe it. The innkeeper and the noblewoman laughed while Sybil played a few notes on her flute. The witch's brow was furrowed, but she must have remembered how the Will you do the honors of singing again, Sally Ann? Sybil asked. You know how I love to sing, the innkeeper gushed. All right, just one song before you all head to bed. I know you have a long day ahead of you tomorrow. Sybil brought the flute to her lips and took a deep inhale. Then she pursed her lips and played the pleasant introduction of a song that sounded like something you'd sing to a small child. Sally Ann took a deep breath and started to sing. My brother told me of a little black dog who likes to play in dreams, and when they play, the little black dog tells him silly things. And my sister whispered of a little black dog who comes when she's asleep, and they play all day in fields of hay and chase the cows and sheep. Sybil played a final refrain while Sally Ann stared off dreamily. I had never liked being sung to as a child, but I had to admit that for some reason that song really made me feel relaxed. That was beautiful, Tabitha yawned. Sally Ann, you should come to the palace and sing for the king. Oh hush, Sally Ann cooed. The last thing the king needs is to be put to sleep by an old maid like me. Now you three should head for your beds. I've a spot of cleaning to do, and some locals who will probably be in later for a spot of relaxing after a day in the fields, but I'll make sure no one gets too rowdy. Thanks so much, Sally Ann, I said. We'll see you in the morning. Night, Sybil sang. Good night, Tabitha waved, and she led the way as we trundled to our room. First door on the right, Sally Ann called after us. I love playing my flute, Sybil sighed. Do either of you like singing much? I sound like a bullfrog when I try to sing, Tabitha laughed, and her voice was so impressively croaky on a good day that I didn't doubt it. I did choir in middle school, I whispered, but I was always off pitch, so they stuck me in the back where no one could hear me. We reached the first floor and Tabitha opened the first door to the right. The inside of the room glowed with dim candlelight, and I could hear an owl hooting outside. Ah, Tabitha declared as she stepped inside. We got a cozy one. Looks nice, I said as I followed the noblewoman into the room. The room was smaller than the attic rooms we'd had before, but very welcoming. The wood panels had a thin layer of stain but no paint, and small portraits of regents and diagrams of flowers had been nailed into the boards every couple of feet. On the far side of the room there was a big square window with long burgundy curtains. A plain floral rug covered most of the floor, though I could still see well-worn floorboards along the edges of the room. 2 beds were on the right side of the room, while the third bed sat alone on the left side. Each bed had a well-sanded tree stump beside it that had a candle and a glass of water. I think it's lovely, Sybil said. We kicked off our shoes and piled them next to the door, and then I started to peel off my armor. By the time I made it down to my shirt and pants, I was nearly wiped out from the effort. I managed to remove my pants, but I decided to wear my shirt and belt to bed. That way I wouldn't have to worry about getting cold or another thief trying to steal the notebook. I am too exhausted, I groaned as I flopped onto my bed. I haven't run like that in months. Me too, Tabitha replied as she yawned. I lifted my head and saw that she had stripped off her armor and outer layers of clothing to reveal one of my Hulk t-shirts and a pair of underwear. Hey, I laughed. You snuck my Hulk stuff. It's comfy, she replied as she climbed into bed. And it's kind of cold in here, so I don't want to be naked. I agree, Sybil said as she wriggled around beneath the sheet to make herself comfortable. But it's way better than sleeping in a room that's too hot. That's true, I said. I can never sleep when I'm sweaty. Tabitha blew out her candle, and Sybil followed suit. It seemed so odd to be sleeping in different beds, but I was exhausted and could have probably slept comfortably on the bench downstairs if I'd had to. I used the last of my energy to reach over and blow out my own candle. The room was enveloped in darkness, so I closed my eyes and let my tiredness wash over me. I was out for what felt like an eternity, though I was sure I'd only been asleep an hour or two. When I opened my eyes, I started feeling around for my Phone so I could check how long I'd been asleep because if I was late for work and Ava had to lug all those books around herself, I'd be toast. Surely. We had a scholastic delivery today since it was the fall. Hank, a female voice said. I looked up and saw it was Tabitha, who was fully clothed much to my disappointment. She did, however, have a cup of coffee in her hand, and the scent of moonbeam brew was enough to rouse me from my half-asleep state. Tabitha, I said and laughed. I had no idea where I was for a moment. Thought I was back in New Jersey. Figures, she said. You were out cold. Sybil wanted to draw a bunch of lewd things on your face with my red ink pen, but I stopped her. I said it wouldn't be appropriate for a knight of the realm. That isn't true at all, Sybil protested from the other side of the room. Hank, it's the opposite. I had to stop Tabitha from drawing a ladies. I laughed and sat up. I rubbed my eyes so that they were more in focus, and then I took the mug of moonbeam brew from Tabitha. I can't believe you tried to pin that on me, Sybil muttered. Don't worry, I replied. I don't believe Tabitha at all. Not one tiny bit. Oh, all right, the noblewoman conceded. I wanted to draw on you. What kind of impression would that make? Sybil asked as she came over and sat on the foot of the bed next to Tabitha. Then she feigned my American accent. Oh, hey, I'm Hank, eternal protector of Lupercalia and royal penis head, and I need your help to decode this notebook. Oh, come on, Tabitha laughed. I wasn't going to do it for real, but it was so funny when they did it on that show. While the girls were bantering, I sucked down the entire mug of moonbeam brew. I felt the electric jolt down in my head, and for a moment even my vision became clearer. I slugged it back so quickly that it took me a moment to realize that something about the brew tasted different. It was like Sally Ann had spiced it with something autumnal and delicious. All right, I said. Well, luckily, the cipher won't be visited by any penis heads today. I'm going to armor up, and then we have to head off. I looked out of the window and realized that the sun was very much still rising. It was truly the crack of dawn, and I hoped that meant we could reach the island by lunchtime. And you'll drink the fuel? Sybil cocked her head to the side like an imploring puppy. Yes, I sighed. I will drink your magic rocket fuel. Wonderful, she said and danced around. We'll be waiting downstairs. Tabitha and Sybil scurried out of the room with their belongings and back down the stairs. I heard them laughing all the way down, and I felt immensely grateful that I had my two amazing women to keep my spirits up on important quests like this. I checked that the pouch was still on my waist and that the notebook was still inside. I breathed a sigh of relief as I felt the sheets of paper, and then I turned to the task of putting my armor back on. When that was done, I did a last sweep of the room and then headed downstairs to join my girls. Hank, Sybil called when she saw me. Sally Ann made honey buns, and they're so good. She swallowed and grinned. I grabbed a honey bun and took a big bite. Oh yeah, they were made with some kind of fruity honey, or maybe even apple butter. Those'll fill you up for your run today, Sally Ann said as she emerged from behind the bar. Thanks so much again for everything, I replied once I swallowed the doughy, delicious lump. I'm sure this'll help tons. Tabitha opened the door and waved at Sally Ann. We'll be back soon, the noblewoman called out. And thanks for everything. You're always welcome here, Sally Ann laughed. Sybil and I gulped down the rest of our honey buns and then stepped outside. We found Tabitha near the field of sweet williams, in a stripe of sunlight that lit her hair. All right, Hank, Tabitha said when she spotted me. Time for you to drink your poison. Hey, Sybil protested. It's not poison. It's magic. Then why couldn't you make it taste like cinnamon buns or something? Tabitha asked. That's not how magic works, Tabitha, Sybil rolled her eyes. Honestly, I said as I rummaged through my sack, it's not so bad. The smell is probably worse than the taste, and once it sinks into your body it feels amazing. Exactly, Sybil said. All right. Tabitha laughed. I want to try it at some point, but not now. Hank, you lead the way, and I'll navigate when we're on the run. Sounds good, I said. I uncorked the bottle and held my nose. Then I brought it to my lips and took a well-measured swig, around the same amount as yesterday. I could barely taste the stuff because I was holding my nose, but my God, did it burn. Yuck. I quickly recorked the bottle as tightly as possible and shoved it back in my bag while I was waiting for the potion to set in. And oh boy, did it set in. I felt like I was being electrocuted. I had never felt more like a glowing neon sign in my life than I did at that moment, but all of a sudden I wanted to go everywhere. I wanted to talk to everyone, see everything, and most importantly, I wanted to run. I leapt forward onto my arms like I was diving into a pool, and I became the great wolf. My body rebalanced itself so that this four-legged alignment felt natural, and I instinctively began to hop from one leg to the next like I was trotting in place. Someone's excited, Tabitha laughed. I mustered all of my strength and patience to sit down while the girls mounted onto my back. Once I felt that they were comfortably situated, I stood up and awaited Tabitha's instructions. All right, she said. You're going to run north for the time being, which, from where we're standing, is this way. She tugged on my right-hand side until I shifted over. Perfect, she said. Now I looked at a bunch of maps of local foliage. Sybil is going to tell me when we reach a certain type of fern that'll appear at the 2-mile marker. Yes, sir, Sybil said. When we reach the 2-mile mark, which won't be long given your speed last time, I'll tug at you to go west, Tabitha continued. Sound good. I pawed at the ground to signal that I understood, and she gave me a pat on the head. All right then, let's ride, puppy, the noblewoman cheered. I took off, and though my sense of smell still lagged behind me, I found it easier to avoid objects around me. I darted in and out of the trees, leapt over logs and rocks, and even cleared an old stone fence, all without breaking pace. I was having such a good time that I barely noticed that someone had started to tug on my neck. Hank! Tabitha! Stop! I suddenly remembered Tabitha's instructions and came to a quick stop that nearly sent the girls tumbling from my back. I offered a low whimper as an apology and then looked over my shoulder. Okay, Tabitha said as she adjusted her spot. Now head that way until you start to smell pine trees. Goodbye, Moravian ferns, Sybil sighed. I'll see you next time. I let the feeling of the speed juice wash over my body again, and it felt like I was being propelled forward by a large motor. It was barely mid-morning, and we were already well on our way to the cipher. I was confident we would finish the rest of the quest just as quickly, and then I would know what the vampires had planned. After a good hour of running, or more like flying, I started to notice that the soft ground that Yerrick was known for had started to give way to something harder. Instead of the mulch undergrowth, I felt like I was running on a terrain that was almost sandy. We're out of Yerrick, Tabitha called. Still a few miles until we reach the purple distraction, but we're getting close. My paws pounded over the uneven surface, and even though I still felt like I was running as fast as a bullet, I started to notice the differences in this forest. There was a rattling sound in the trees that I couldn't quite identify that reminded me of the cicadas back in Jersey. The birds here sounded different, too. I shot a look over at one of the trees, and saw that there was a large green snake perched on one of the branches. I had never been much afraid of snakes, but I was surprised to see one so high up. I think this is it, Tabitha yelled. I slowed down to a trot and saw that we were surrounded by towering pine trees. I had no idea how long I'd been running, but it felt like it must have been at least an hour or so. I looked up to the sky to see where the sun was, and its position made me think that it must be mid to late afternoon. As I plodded through the trees, a wall of smell hit me like a ton of bricks, and I recognized it immediately. It was the smell of lavender, which my mom had always left in small cloth bags around the house to make the place smell nice. But this was way beyond a few bags of potpourri. Felt like the smell was taking over my whole body, and I could have fallen asleep right there on the spot. Do you smell that? Sybil asked. Yeah, Tabitha sighed. It's so-so. And then the noblewoman let out a big yawn that alerted me that the purple distraction was working its magic on her too. Hank, Sybil called as she tried to stifle a yawn of her own. We should try to move through here as quickly as possible. I gave her my wolf version of a nod, but it was hard not to just sit down on the spot and catch a nap. I forced myself to count the trees that we passed, until I broke through the tree-line and came upon the edge of a field. The purple distraction. It wasn't the largest field of lavender I'd ever seen, but it was certainly the most potent. It was also beautiful, and I had to stop for a moment just to admire it. This is insane, Tabitha laughed. This is more beautiful than any tapestry I've ever seen in my life. I'm glad you think so, Sybil said dreamily. Nature really is beautiful. There was no choice but to go straight through the lavender field, so I decided I'd make it fun for the girls. I bounded through the purple field as sprigs of fresh lavender popped out of the ground and flew at us. My burst of activity had the added bonus of keeping everyone awake, despite the overwhelming scent of the flowers. Hank, Sybil laughed. You're acting like Casanova. And I like it, Tabitha added with a squeal. By the time we reached the other side, my dark fur was full of lavender, which made me smell like the most well-kept dog on the planet. I did sneeze a couple of times as pollen went up my nose, but I was feeling pretty good. Still, we needed to put some distance between us and the lavender before we all decided to take a nap, so I bounded forward as a cloud of purple petals floated in my wake. I hadn't traveled very far when I spotted something shimmering in the sunlight, and then I picked up the scent of cold, fresh water. We'd reached Gomel. Wow, Tabitha laughed. We made it here in 3 hours. That must be some sort of record. 3 hours? To me it had felt more like 15 minutes. I slowed down to a trot again as we reached the shoreline. The sand here was wet and heavy, and yet the pine trees were the tallest we'd seen so far. The lakeside specimens were at least 50 feet tall, and they cast a cool shade over the water's edge. If I didn't know better, I'd have thought we were in Washington or Canada somewhere. I've never seen trees this tall, Sybil said. I had no idea there were even trees this tall in Lupercalia. This is one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen, Tabitha replied. And to think that everyone said this lake was full of monsters. I found a reasonably dry spot to stop and let the girls slide off. While they found their land legs again, I closed my eyes and took a deep sniff of the air around the lake. It was fresh, clean, and only slightly sweet. It was like pollution had never touched it. Look, Sybil said and pointed. There's a hut in the distance, and there's smoke coming from the chimney. I rose onto my hind legs, changed into my hybrid form, and walked over to the girls. At 9 feet, I had a better view of the lake and the islands that dotted its surface. Most were little more than rocks, but on the far side, there was an island large enough to accommodate a thicket of trees and a brick hut. A thin trail of white smoke drifted lazily on the breeze, and I caught the scent of burning wood. That must be where the grumpy old man lives, Tabitha said. And I'd be willing to bet that's our cipher. Who else would live in the middle of the lake? Sybil replied and rolled her eyes. While the girls teased each other, I looked around for a way across the lake. I could always change back into wolf form and run around the lake, though. Given how vast it was, that seemed like a waste of time. There had to be a boat or something we could use, though it didn't seem like very many people ever made it to the lake. Guys, I asked when I spotted another snake on a nearby branch. Is it normal for snakes to be just hanging out like that? Tabitha and Sybil stopped their faux fight and looked toward the branch where I was now pointing. I'll keep it real with you, Hank, Tabitha replied with a line from one of the many movies she'd ingested in her time in New Jersey. I have no idea why there are snakes here. Maybe that's why there are so many monster rumors, Sybil added with a shrug. Well, that's a monster I can live with, I said. So, any suggestions on how we get to the island? Do you have any potions that will turn Hank into a fish? Tabitha teased. Nope, Sybil sighed. That kind of magic is way out of my league. We need a boat, I said as I started to search the bushes. And I'm guessing the cipher keeps a boat hidden over here somewhere for visitors to use. He would have to mark the spot with a symbol or something, Tabitha said as she squinted at the trees. So his guests would be able to find it. Here, Sybil called out. There's a rune on this tree. I spotted the small design that someone had carved into the trunk. It wasn't much, just a couple of wavy lines that looked like a child's sketch of water. But from my height, I could also see something flash in the brambles. This is it, I said as I tossed some branches aside. The deadwood revealed a fallen tree, but tucked beneath that was a small rowboat with a pair of oars. In my hybrid form, it was easy enough to pull the boat from its resting spot and set it on the water. Well, it looks sturdy, Tabitha said as she eyed the boat suspiciously. I don't see any leaks, I assured her. But they only get really bad when you're in the middle of the lake, the noblewoman replied. At least, that's how it always happens in the cartoon movies. Don't tell me you're afraid of the water, Sybil said. No, not the water, Tabitha said as she looked toward the lake. But what's in it? Hank is here to kill any monsters in the lake, Sybil replied. I'm sure it's fine, I said. Here, I'll hold the boat steady while you two get in. Sybil was the first to lift her skirts and clamber in. She moved to the small bench at the front of the boat, and then smiled at me and Tabitha. "Looks like you two are rowing this time," the witch said sweetly. "I'm actually quite a good rower," Tabitha replied as she took a spot on the center bench. "We'll be there in no time." I started to step in and then realized that I was too big in my hybrid form. Closed my eyes for a second, felt the strange tug and pull as my body reshaped itself, and then peeked down at my feet to find I was back in human form. "I feel like the princess today," Sybil sighed. I grinned as I pushed the boat from the shore and then hopped in. Once I was in my spot, Tabitha and I plunged our oars into the water and started to paddle out into the lake. "We're pretty good at this," the noblewoman said as we plowed through the water. "Yep," I agreed. "Just as long as we keep a rhythm going, we should be fine." For several minutes, the only sound was the slap of the oars against the water and our breathing. Near the middle of the lake, I started to realize just how big it really was, and I wondered if we'd even make it to the island before my arms gave out. "So," Tabitha said in a shaky voice, "what the hell is that?" The noblewoman had stopped rowing and was using the oar to point to something in the water. It took a moment, but then a large shadow passed beneath the boat. "Shit," I muttered as I leaned closer to the water. The water was clear enough that I could see schools of fish whenever they skimmed close to the surface, but I quickly spotted a few more shadows in the depths as well. "I always heard that there were creatures in this lake," Sybil laughed nervously. "But I thought that was just folklore." "Folklore, my ass," Tabitha snapped as another shadow passed under the boat. "There is definitely something large in this lake." "There's no reason to think it's dangerous," I pointed out. But just as I said it, the boat jolted like we were going over a speed bump, and when I looked down at the water, a silver creature slipped past and swam away. "Okay," I said. "The most important thing is to stay calm." I glanced over the side of the boat again and saw that, underneath the perfect blue water, a pair of eyes was staring at us. "Perfect," Tabitha said as she glanced over her side of the boat. "It's watching us." Sybil corrected. "There's more than one." "That's not what I needed to hear," the blonde replied. The creature on my side swam closer to the surface, and for a second I had a really good view. I saw a creature that resembled a horse, but with the silver scales of a fish. It had a long, elegant tail with fins and flippers for feet. "My goodness," Tabitha whispered. "I've never seen anything like that." The creature didn't move, but instead stared at us curiously, like we were the weird-looking ones. "It seems pretty harmless," Sybil said and then waved at it. For a second, it poked its head out of the water, and then it dove back down, playfully out of sight. "Whoa," I whispered. "Sybil, that was amazing." "I'm just being friendly," she said. "But I have an idea." The dark-haired witch reached into her basket and pulled out her wooden flute. "You're going to play for it?" Tabitha asked in surprise. "I've only heard about this kind of thing in folktales, but I know that the pigs used to love it when I'd play for them," Sybil replied. "You're certainly confident about your musical abilities," Tabitha replied. Sybil brought her flute to her mouth, pursed her lips, and then started to play the same lullaby from the night before. First nothing changed, but then the water seemed to go quiet, and the shadows stilled. "Tabitha," I whispered. "Look. It's like she has them in some kind of trance," Tabitha whispered back. "Start rowing," I said. "Nice, easy strokes so we don't break the magic." Tabitha nodded, and we slowly resumed our trip across Gomel while Sybil played on. I was super impressed with Sybil on this quest. Not only had she cut our travel time down exponentially, but now she'd found a way to give us safe passage across the lake. I definitely had to come up with a reward for my favorite witch. "That cipher better be in," Tabitha muttered. "If he's run out to get a bottle of milk or something after all this effort, I'll kill him." I laughed, but we were close enough to the island that when I glanced over my shoulder I could see the rocky shore, the thick pines, and the white smoke that still drifted from the chimney. When the boat scraped against the shallows, I hopped out, changed back into my hybrid form, and then pulled the boat onto dry land with one hand. "Thanks, Hank," Sybil said once the boat was safely stowed on shore. "I'm at your service," I replied with a bow. Tabitha hopped out quickly, but Sybil remained on her bench for a moment. "Are you okay?" I asked. "Just give me a second," Sybil said. "I've never been on a boat before and I'm kind of dizzy." "You've never been on a boat before?" I asked. Nope, she said and shook her head. That was my first time and honestly I started playing my flute to help calm my nerves. You guys had me worried that there was something dangerous around us. But I liked that horsefish we saw. She had a very nice energy. I've only seen things like that on maps, Tabitha replied. Or in storybooks. I thought that they were just illustrations because nobody ever told me. Otherwise, maybe they thought I'd just stay in the palace my whole life, instead of exploring what was out there. Either way, it was amazing. It was interesting, I said. I've never seen anything like it before either. Well, it looks like we managed to put in near the hut. Shall we see if the cipher is home? Just remember that he hates company, Sybil said. We'll just have to be extra charming then, Tabitha said. So you better leave it to me. Ha! Sybil barked. Because you're famous for your charm. He used to live in the palace, Tabitha sniffed. I'm sure we could find some common ground. We made it over the rocks and followed a dirt path toward the hut. It was round like Sybil's but made of brick. It sat in the middle of a patch of pines which kept it shaded. A small brook cut through the yard and a small herb garden nestled at the edge of the property. Not a bad location, Sybil sighed. You get the beach from the lake and the seclusion of the woods. If we were in Jersey, this definitely would have been up our street. Sure, I laughed. Well, we would have had to expand the house a bit. Oh, I don't know, Tabitha purred. It looks cozy. You say that now, I replied. But you would miss the walk-in closets and the swimming pool. So true, Tabitha sighed and winked. As we neared the hut, I saw there was a large crescent moon engraved on the door similar to the one on the royal seal. It seemed the cipher hadn't totally abandoned his ties to the court, which I hoped meant he would at least hear us out. Here goes, I said to the girls and knocked on the door 3 times. We waited for several heartbeats, but all we heard was the gentle trickle of water from the brook and blue jays in the trees. Maybe he did run out to get some milk, Sybil snickered. Not on my watch, Tabitha shot back. I knocked another 3 times, but this time I heard someone moving around on the other side. Preposterous, the occupant yelled. Absolutely preposterous. But the door remained closed in our faces, and when I glanced at Tabitha I saw her roll her eyes. I knocked a 3rd time and the hut went silent again. Hello, I called in my most polite wolf voice. Hello, the voice called back sarcastically without opening the door. Do you have a delivery of some kind? No, I said. Then why are you bothering me? The voice demanded. We need your help, Sybil chimed in. Help? The voice snapped. Ha! How did you even find me here? It was a pain in the ass, Tabitha shot back and Sybil's eyes widened in shock. So the least you could do to show your appreciation for the ridiculous amount of effort we put into finding you would be to open the door and hear our request. I certainly hope you don't treat all the messengers from the palace this way. I held my breath and wondered if we were about to be shot with some sort of magic weapon. It seemed like a real possibility after Tabitha's response, and I started to check the eaves for any signs of magically endowed snakes that would drop on us. But something Tabitha said must have struck a chord because the door finally creaked open. Chapter 9. You know, Sybil said and went to get a glass from the cupboard. That time wasn't so bad. In fact, I'd venture to say that I found the boat more stressful. Yeah, Tabitha agreed and brushed herself off. This is getting easier every time. I set my sack on the kitchen table and did a few stretches to loosen my back. I love going on quests in Lupercalia, but right then I just felt relieved to be back at home, where magical forces of evil and fantastical monsters were something you watched on TV. Even though we were technically still on our quest, I was happy that this part of it was something as benign as going to Whole Foods. Right, ladies, I said. Time to change into something more comfortable. I ran into my room, and the girls chased behind me giggling. Thank goodness, Tabitha said and ripped her breastplate off. I was starting to get a little tired of wearing this old thing. I watched as the girls stripped down to their underwear and then peered into my closet, which was now completely overtaken with their jersey clothes. Tabitha was wearing light pink boy shorts and a light pink sports bra that she had bought here but wore in Lupercalia as well. She said it was more comfortable for quests and plus it made her look amazing. The tight, stretchy fabric sucked in her tits so that they were pushed out at the top, so she looked like an athletic Marilyn Monroe. Sybil, on the other hand, almost never wore underwear. Today she was wearing a simple pair of white cotton panties, but this was the exception. I pulled off my armor and then I removed my boots and my leg pieces. I felt like a lizard shedding its skin. Then I threw off all my suede gear. Today was a t-shirt and jeans kind of day. Oh, perfect! Tabitha exclaimed as she pulled out a big, soft t-shirt with Madonna on it and a pair of black stretchy leggings. As the blonde stepped aside and fumbled into the leggings, Sybil scrutinized the clothing that was on offer in the closet. Sybil, Tabitha laughed. You basically only own long billowy dresses. What's taking so long? Obviously, I don't know which long billowy dress I want to wear today. The witch replied. Tabitha rolled her eyes and pulled on the shirt. Then she rummaged through my sock drawer to find a pair of socks. Ah, perfect! Sybil exclaimed as she pulled out a long black dress that came to her ankles. What a surprise! Tabitha laughed as she pulled her boots back on. She really knew how to dress in a way that flattered her long, tall body. Even in a simple dress, she looked incredibly elegant and managed to catch the attention of passers-by. Excuse me, I said and stepped over to the closet. Sybil winked at me and moved aside, and I felt a jolt of heat rush down my spine. She was so hot. I grabbed a pair of jeans and a white t-shirt with Bugs Bunny on it. There would be no Hulk t-shirt today, mostly because all of my Hulk gear had somehow ended up in Lupercalia. I stepped into my jeans, pulled on my t-shirt, threw on my shoes, and I was good to go. All right, I said as I ran my fingers through my hair. Let's hit Whole Foods. And then I have another short errand in mind. Oh really? Tabitha asked. And what kind of errand would that be? You'll see, I said with a grin. I found the keys to the Jeep in their usual spot by the door, so I scooped them up along with my wallet before we stepped outside. It was cool and bright in New Jersey, and I smiled as I saw the piles of leaves in the yards and smelled a nearby wood fire. It was late enough in the day that schools had started to let out, and I saw a couple of kids dragging their backpacks home from the bus stop. Front seat, Sybil yelled as she ran to the Jeep. As if I would sit there, Tabitha said and rolled her eyes. I grinned because I knew Tabitha had enjoyed it the few times she'd managed to ride shotgun, but somehow the blonde was never fast enough when it came to claiming the seat. At least someone's excited, I said as we piled into the Jeep. So, Tabitha said as I started the engine, I think we can all agree that it's been a long time since we were in the car together, and yes, fine, Sybil groaned. We can listen to No Doubt if you want. Perfect, Tabitha said and clapped her hands. They are my favorite Bart troupe. Would you like to do the honors? I asked as I handed the iPhone to Tabitha. Thank you, she sang. I pulled out of the driveway just as Gwen Stefani's voice came blasting over the sound system. This is way better than the boat, Sybil declared happily. Glad someone thinks so. I laughed. But even I had to admit, it felt pretty good to zoom down the highway while rock music blared over the radio. I looked in the rearview mirror at Tabitha, who was shouting along in her croaky voice. After the chorus, Tabitha seemed kind of puffed out, and she slunk back comfortably onto the seats for the guitar solo. So Tabitha, Sybil asked, did you used to smoke tobacco as a child, or has your voice always sounded like that? Pa! Tabitha laughed. I've never smoked a day in my life. Smoking isn't something that the Lupercalian nobles enjoy. It's something that only vampires and other undesirable creatures do, well, at least in Lupercalia. A lot more people seem to smoke here. I recalled that both Windroth and the first vampire we'd killed both had old tobacco boxes in their stash of items. So how come vampires smoke? I asked. Not sure, Tabitha shrugged. Some kind of oral fixation maybe. But to answer your question, Sybil, yes, I have always sounded like this. I snickered as we made a right turn onto a tree-lined side street. Leaves drifted around us and young kids ran around in the yards. The road curved past a park in the old high school, and then we were back at another busy road. As we waited for the light to change, I could pick out signs for the usual suburban shopping destinations like Target, Home Depot, and of course, Whole Foods. Yippee! Sybil cheered. We're here. I've never met someone who could get so excited by vegetables, Tabitha mumbled. You just don't appreciate the magic of plants, Sybil laughed. We pulled into the parking lot a few minutes later, and both of the girls popped out before I'd actually turned the engine off. At least they didn't run. in front of the other cars like Sybil had done on her first trip to New Jersey, but it seemed like a few safety reminders might be in order. So what's the name of this thing again? Tabitha asked when I caught up with them. Washi bees. Wasabi, Sybil said. It was that super spicy stuff you ate at the sushi place that made your nose burn. Oh, that stuff, Tabitha sniffed. Well, if there's any left over after Melchior finishes, maybe we can suggest he sample some. You're a very cruel woman, I teased. Always, Tabitha replied with a grin. Okay, I said as we stepped through the automatic doors. The issue is that the stuff we eat in the restaurants is actually not real wasabi. It's a Western wasabi, but I'm sure Whole Foods will have the real stuff here. But Sybil had already spotted something in the vegetable aisle that she had to try. She skipped away from my side and headed toward a display table. Of course, I sighed as Tabitha and I followed in her wake. What is that? Tabitha asked as Sybil picked up a small paper cup. I don't know, but they smell delicious, she said. Like vanilla and rose. She tipped the cup into her hand and took a deep sniff of the waxy item that fell out. Wait, Sybil, stop, I said, but it was too late. The witch popped the pink and white substance in her mouth, and then her face contorted into a twisted look of confusion as she chewed on the soap sample. It's sour, she said, and then spat it into her hand as covertly as possible. So unladylike, Tabitha said. What was that, anyway? Soap, I replied as I tried not to laugh. But it smelled so yummy, Sybil sighed as she dropped the handful of soap into a nearby garbage can. How couldn't you tell that it was soap? Tabitha snickered. Sorry, we don't have lavender-infused everything in the village, Sybil huffed. It looked like a yummy treat to me, like a weird cake or something. So provincial, Tabitha purred, and Sybil rolled her eyes at her. Here, I said as I dug a packet of gum from my jacket pocket. Chew on this. Oh, thank the goddess, Sybil said as she grabbed one of the pieces. It's the super minty one. May I have a piece? Tabitha asked politely, even though I didn't put any soap in my mouth. Yes, of course you can. I laughed and handed her a piece. Now let's find that wasabi. The fresh fruits and vegetables section included an entire row of less common items like daikon radish, dragon fruit, bitter melons, and yard-long beans. There were always at least 3 old Asian ladies poking the produce in that aisle, and today was no exception. Do you see it? Sybil whispered as I tried to squeeze between 2 of the ladies. Hang on, I said as I checked the signs. One of the old ladies glared at me, but I ignored her. I just spotted the knobby green root thing on display beneath the real Japanese wasabi sign. Didn't even bother to check the price as I reached over the glaring woman and snagged 2 pieces of the fish-shaped root. Honestly, I was sure the cipher could make do with just one, but I also wanted to fuck with the man. Here, Tabitha said as she held a paper bag. Thanks, I replied as I dropped the wasabi inside and then smiled at the 3 Chinese ladies. We started to make our way back to the register, but then I stopped when I spotted the aisle with dried herbs and spice. Sybil, just to be clear, when you winked at me back at the cipher's place, when he mentioned the red bergamot, that meant you had some, right? Yes, she laughed. It's growing on the estate in abundance. It's a very aromatic and powerful plant that's used in rare spells, and it was one of the first I brought back from New Jersey. Good, I said. So we'll just pop over to the estate next, collect the red bergamot, and then drop all this off with our cipher. Yep, she said. And with your rocket fuel, Tabitha added, we'll be able to make it in no time. I took another look at the map this morning while you were sleeping in, and I think I've worked out a shorter route that avoids Yerrick altogether. Oh, look at that, Sybil moaned as we passed a table stacked with boxes of cinnamon buns. It looks like they just put some fresh ones in the self-serve, I laughed as one of the bakery assistants finished filling the display case. Yum, Sybil said as she strolled over to the plastic boxes. And what about you, Tabitha? I asked. I'm good for now, the blonde said as she watched Sybil select a cinnamon bun and drop it in a paper bag. But we haven't eaten since breakfast, I said. Why not get something and save it for later? I was aware that Tabitha would often wait until she was hungry before thinking about food. Then when she was starving, she'd be too inconsolably grumpy to think of anything to eat. All right, she sighed. I'll grab a bagel. Would you like one too? That would be perfect, I said. Tabitha sauntered over to the self-serve display, grabbed a paper bag and then took a very long time selecting 2 bagels. By the time she rejoined me, and Sybil, the witch had already pinched off several pieces of her cinnamon bun and was fighting the urge to demolish the rest of it in the store. There, Tabitha declared as she held up the paper bag. 2 perfect bagels. Great, I said before Sybil could comment. Let's check out and then head back. When we reached the checkout lines, only one seemed to be moving. We quickly hopped behind a woman with a buggy full of apples before the woman with 2 kids and what looked like a month's worth of groceries for me could get ahead of us. That's a lot of apples, Sybil remarked. You must be making pies or preserves. The old lady with the apples turned around and smiled at Sybil. It's for my famous apple cobbler, the old woman said. I have to use pink ladies, Granny Smith's Macintosh and... But suddenly she was interrupted. Everybody dropped to the floor. An angry male voice boomed from behind us. I swung around and saw a big burly guy wearing a black balaclava and wielding a 9mm. Shit, there was no way I was gonna let this fly. The cashier for our line, a young man who didn't look a day over 17, was completely frozen. The other cashiers looked confused for a moment and one young woman looked toward the door like she wanted to make a run for it. I said everybody get down on the floor. The robber repeated and pointed the gun at the teen. Put all the money in this bag, the robber ordered as he tossed the kid in old duffel bag, and then pass it to the next register. The customers were crouched on the floor, and a few muffled sobs hung in the air. The cobbler-making older lady in our line was quivering, and I saw Tabitha reach out and squeeze her hand. I just needed something I could use as a weapon, but a paper bag with a cinnamon bun didn't seem helpful. The woman with the kids had a full cart, so it was possible I could find something in there, though mostly what I could see was boxes of cereal and fruit roll-ups. My eyes drifted toward the old lady's cart, and I briefly considered what I could do with an apple or 2. But then I spotted something else in her groceries. There was a large leg of lamb that looked like it was still frozen. All I needed was a chance to grab the leg. I checked on the robber who was urging the cashier to be quicker, and then turned to Sybil. I mouthed the word hex as I pointed at the gunman, and the witch nodded. When the robber turned his back on us, Sybil lifted her hand, pointed her fingers in the gunman's direction, and muttered something under her breath. Her green eyes glowed for a moment, and then a smirk crossed her face. The gun slipped from the robber's hand, and even though he tried to catch it, he couldn't hold on to it. He stared in confusion as it once again tumbled from his fingers like someone had coated it with butter. When the gun clattered to the floor, he bent down to retrieve it. This was my chance. In what felt like slow motion, I grabbed the leg of lamb out of the old lady's cart, ran up behind the thief, and smashed the man over the head with my club. The frozen meat was as hard as a 2x4, and it sounded like one as it made contact with the back of the man's head. The shocked robber hovered for half a second before eventually falling onto his side unconscious. His chest still moved up and down, but his eyes had rolled back in his head, and the rest of his body had gone limp. Someone call 911, I said as I kicked the gun away from the robber. I heard some murmurs as people started to stand up, and then Tabitha let out a whoop. A moment later, the rest of the customers started to clap as well while Sybil stepped up and gave me a kiss on the cheek. Way to go, Hank, Tabitha cheered. Dude, the kid behind the register declared. That was awesome. You saved my ass. I'm just glad no one was hurt, I said. Good thing he dropped his gun. Yeah, man, the kid agreed. That was weird but lucky. Is everyone okay? A round man with a Whole Foods polo asked as he ran up. We're fine, Mr. B, the kid said. Thanks to this guy. Thank you, sir, Mr. B said as he grabbed my free hand. I'm the manager, Fred Beatty. By then, others were waiting to shake my hand, and I could hear the sound of sirens nearing the store. A few people recognized me from the memes, and I could already imagine what kind of posts about me would go up next. At some point, the police actually arrived, and 2 officers quickly took the thief into custody. Hank, another officer said as he took in the scene. Bob, I replied when I recognized my dad's old friend. How are you doing? I'm just great, he laughed. But how are you? Did you really stop this guy? With a leg of lamb. I realized I was still holding the frozen meat and returned it to the old woman's cart. Well, I saw my chance and took it, I said. You know your father would want me to give you the lecture about not doing stupid things. Bob said and shook his head. And I will, but first I'm just glad you're all right, and I'm glad no one was hurt. So, thanks for taking this guy out. The would-be robber was sitting up, and one of the cops pulled the mask off. He looked to be about my age with blonde hair and freckled skin, but I didn't recognize him. If he lived nearby, he must have been a new arrival to town. Now why the hell would anyone try to rob a Whole Foods? Bob asked as the stranger was jerked to his feet. I was put up to it, the robber replied. Sure you were, Bob replied, and then signaled the officers to take the man away. It's a pretty high-class place for a supermarket, I noted. He probably figured there would be lots of cash and lots of security, Bob replied. The silent alarm was triggered as soon as he pulled out that gun. It's also close to the station. There was no way he would have gotten away, even if you hadn't whacked him with the lamb. My dad used to say that most criminals are stupid, I noted. That guy would seem to be proof of that. Bob chuckled, and then his eyes opened in surprise as Sybil and Tabitha sidled up next to me. Sybil had a Whole Foods reusable bag in her hand, and it looked like it held more than just a cinnamon bun, a couple of bagels, and some wasabi. And who are these lovely ladies? Bob asked. I'm Sybil, Sybil said with a smile, and her emerald eyes sparkled in the fluorescent lighting. And I'm Tabitha Blueclaw, Tabitha responded. She shook his hand firmly, which obviously surprised the officer. Well, any friends of the bakers are friends of mine, Bob assured them. Did you pick up some extra groceries? I asked. That nice manager gave us a few treats from the bakery, Sybil replied with a grin. He insisted that we didn't have to pay for any of it, and he said we would always be welcome here. Which is appropriate, since you did stop a robbery and save everyone's lives, Tabitha added. All right, I laughed. Let's stop there. We have errands to run. Remember, ladies. Of course, Sybil said and winked. We should probably get going. We don't want to be late. But Hank, Bob protested. We'll need to interview you. I'll call you, I said as I hurried toward the exit. I'll set up a time to come talk to you. We need statements from everyone, Bob replied. Hank. I promise I'll give you one, I called back. We slipped through the automatic doors with several other customers. Apparently, everyone wanted to get home rather than hang around and give statements. The officers who were there were talking to as many people as they could, but the girls and I weren't the only ones who slipped away. Hank, that was insane, Sybil said. It's like you can't go anywhere without doing a good deed. I felt myself blush at the praise, which was not something I usually had heaped on me. Then again, I'd never killed a cyclops, saved a kingdom, or taken out a robber before. My father used to say something similar, Tabitha said. Once you're a knight, the instinct to help never leaves you. It's in the blood. Well, he would say it was in the blue blood, but you're clearly a knight through and through. The noblewoman looked up at me and smiled through her dark, coal-lined eyes. Her wispy blonde hair floated in the autumn breeze, and I felt luckier than ever to have a girl like Tabitha on my side. We'd made it to the Jeep without getting stopped by a cop or a grateful shopper, and when I unlocked the doors, I let out a sigh of relief that we'd be back in Lupercalia soon. It was a surprise, though, when both of the girls climbed into the back seat. Hey! I laughed and shut the door behind me. What, so I'm the chauffeur now? I just felt like sitting in the back this time, Sybil said with a shrug. Hope that's not a problem. If the witch wants to ride in the back, then who am I to stop her? I smiled. And just to double-check, along with all the free baked goods, we have the wasabi, right? We have everything, Sybil assured me. Except for the cinnamon bun that you shoved in your mouth as soon as the police came, Tabitha teased. What? Sybil laughed. I was starving, and the whole situation was making me a little bit anxious. I recalled a vague memory of reading an Archie comic where Jughead said a similar thing. When I thought about it, there were similarities between the two. Both were tall and lanky, possessed niche interests, and had an endless appetite. But I didn't want the comparison between Sybil and Jughead to go much further than that, so I tried to push it out of my head. Where to now? Tabitha yawned. Not that we haven't had enough excitement for one day. I might venture to say we may even have had too much. We're heading to the bank, I said as I eased out of the parking lot behind a Porsche. Why? Sybil asked. I think it's time we closed the deal on the house, I replied, which drew Squeals from the back seat. After a short trip along the highway, I took the exit that would take me to the bank where Ava and I kept our accounts. It wasn't one of the big national banks, but it was where our parents and grandparents had all kept their accounts, and it seemed like the natural thing for us to do as well. The bank had been in the same building for over a century, though other businesses had cropped up around it over the years. At the moment it was wedged between a yoga studio and a nail salon, and I sometimes wondered which of the establishments had been opened first. "You girls coming?" I asked as I climbed out of the Jeep. "Of course," Sybil said as she opened the door. "If I must," Tabitha sighed as she oozed out of the back seat. Our entrance to the bank was announced by a small bell that was attached to the door. For some reason the place was air-conditioned even in the fall, and I wished that I'd brought a sweater. The place looked empty even though the sign said the place was open for another hour. Where is everyone?" Sybil asked. "It's a bank," I said. "They're not busy all the time." At least there was no line, so I walked up to the only open teller station and rang the desk bell. I could hear someone moving around in the back room, and I leaned against the counter to wait. "How cute," Tabitha whispered as she rang the bell again. "Don't do that," I said. "That's considered rude." "Let me try," Sybil whispered and dinged the bell for a third time. "Guys," I protested and then shook my head while I waited for the bank teller to come tell me what an asshole I was. But instead, a kind-looking middle-aged woman with reading glasses connected to a chain came out and sat at the desk. Oh my," she said. "Usually when there's more than one ring we assume someone's brought their toddler." "We didn't mean to be rude," Tabitha smiled. "It was just very fun." The teller, whose hair was dyed a satisfying shade of magnolia, nodded slowly. "Yes," the older woman said. "I guess it is. How may I help you today?" "My name is Henry Baker," I said as I handed over my ATM card. "I sent Mr. Palermo an email earlier this week about a cashier's check. He was supposed to have that ready today." The teller swiped my card, typed something into the computer, and then her eyes widened in surprise. "Well, I see Mr. Palermo has the check ready," she said as she turned to me. With a smile. "I just need to see some ID to confirm." "Of course," I said politely as I handed over my driver's license. She typed the information from my license into the computer, clicked a few more times, and then returned my license and ATM card. "I'll let Mr. Palermo know you're here," she said as she stood up. "Would you like some tea or coffee while you wait?" "We're good," I replied. "We just had some coffee." She smiled and then disappeared into one of the offices. Her shoes barely made any noise on the hard floor, and I wondered if that was one of the requirements of the job. "It smells like paper in here," Sybil whispered, though her voice seemed to echo off the marble. "I hadn't thought of it that way," I replied. "I just think of it as a bank smell." "We don't have banks in Lupercalia," Tabitha whispered. "Of course you do," I said in a light-hearted whisper. "How else do you store your money?" "I'm not sure," she admitted and shrugged. "It's not the kind of thing I was ever taught to worry about. Money lending is frowned upon." "Sounds like we'll need to do some research when we get back," I teased. The kind lady with magnolia-colored hair emerged from the office with a dark-haired man on her heels. The man had a smile plastered on his face, and he quickly brushed a stray strand of hair from his face with one hand while he smoothed out the wrinkles in his suit jacket with the other. "Mr. Baker," the man said as he approached the window. "It's nice to finally put a face with the name." "Mr. Palermo?" I guessed. "It's been a while. I think the last time I saw you was when my dad set up a checking account I could use for college expenses." "I remember that," he laughed, though I wasn't convinced he really did. "Your parents were wonderful people, and I'm so happy that you and your sister have been doing well. So well, in fact, that you could request such a hefty sum." "Were there any issues?" I asked. "None whatsoever," he replied. "Are you investing in something? We have financial services if you need advice." "Or, I'm actually buying a house," I replied. "And I decided to do it with cash." "Excellent," Palermo declared. "Homes are wonderful investments." "Well, we should get going," I said. "I want to get to the title company before they close." "Of course," Mr. Palermo agreed. "And congratulations on your success and your new home." With that, he handed over the cashier's check. I checked that the amount and Name was correct, shook Mr. Palermo's hand, waved to the teller and then led the girls back to the street. So now what? Tabitha asked as we piled into the Jeep. To the title company, I said. I'll turn over the check, we'll sign all the paperwork, and then we spend the night in our new house. This is so exciting, Sybil said and clapped her hands. And by the way, I said as I pulled out of the lot, thanks for your help at Whole Foods. I might be getting the credit for the save, but I couldn't have done it without you too. Especially you, Sybil. That hex you used was perfect. I just wish I could tell people about it. You could, Tabitha said, but no one here would believe you. Or maybe just chalk it up as another weird story I made up to sell more coffee, I mused. Well, we know the truth, so thank you, Sybil. Yes, thank you, Sybil, Tabitha added. I glanced over at the witch and saw that her cheeks were flushed. Her eyes fluttered for a moment, but when she caught me looking, she tried to wave away. Our thanks. It was nothing, Sybil declared. It's just a spell I've been working on, but I haven't had a reason to use it. It'll be handy during our quests, I said. Absolutely, Tabitha agreed with a laugh. Imagine if you could have done that to Wenderoth. That battle would have been over a lot sooner. The girls laughed, and a moment later, Tabitha started to quiz Sybil on other hexes that she knew. The pair were happy, and I was happy just listening to them. It was hard to believe that these amazing women had come into my life only a few months before, because I couldn't imagine my life without them. The title company was in an office park mostly filled with dentists and accountants. The suite we wanted was squeezed between a fancy spa that offered a weird variety of facials and a small organic health shop, the only other non-dental and non-accounting businesses in the place. I'm so excited that the house is almost ours, Tabitha declared as we pulled into an empty spot next to the realtor's silver SUV and a dark red Porsche. I can't wait to start on my garden, Sybil replied. First, we have to get the keys, I laughed. The office we stepped into was all beige and blue, and featured thick carpet that muffled every step, soothing artwork on the walls and framed photos of the various agents. An assistant sat behind a modern chrome desk, and she looked up with a slightly bored expression when the door opened. Oh, the assistant said when she recognized me. Mr. Baker, we've been waiting for you. She stood up and walked around the desk, and I had my first good look at her. She was young, not a day over 25, and was wearing a gray pencil skirt and a short-sleeved white blouse, all tucked in by a black leather belt. She had on sheer tights and old-fashioned kitten heels that reminded me of an airline hostess uniform from the 60s. Her curly, dirty blonde hair was tied back in an elegantly messy bun, and bright blue eyes peeped out from behind a pair of red-framed glasses. We've set aside conference room B for you, she continued as she held open a second door that led to the rest of the offices. The paperwork is ready for you to sign. Good, I said. And I have the check. She nodded, but she didn't say anything else until she'd shown us into a small room with a table for chairs and a water cooler. The room smelled like Lysol, but at least the chairs were comfortable. The assistant left us alone for a few minutes and then returned with a sizable stack of papers. I've put a post-it for each line you need to sign, she said. There weren't any changes to the drafts we sent you, but I'm sure you'd like to review the contracts with your attorneys before you sign. The young woman glanced at Tabitha and Sybil, and I realized she was trying to figure out who they were. These are friends of mine, I said. Not my attorneys. I'll just read through the document to make sure it's good, and then I'll sign everything. You can just press that button by the door when you're done, the assistant replied. Thanks, I said. The assistant slipped from the room and closed the door quietly behind her. For a moment, the only thing I heard was the ticking of the clock that hung on the back wall. Okay, I sighed. I just need to make sure this is the same thing I sent to my lawyer, and then we're good to go. I picked up the stack of papers and started to wade through the legalese. It was tedious, but as far as I could tell, it was the exact same thing I'd read before. Basically, the land and everything on it, above it and below it, was mine free and clear, and I was grinning when I reached the last page. You look happy, Tabitha noted. I'm about to buy a very big fucking house. I laughed as I started to sign the paperwork. The number of signatures required added another half hour to our visit, but I finally signed the last page, flipped through twice to make sure I hadn't missed any, and then nodded to Sybil, whose hand hovered over the button. The assistant reappeared so fast that I suspected she had been hovering nearby. She accepted the stack of documents and retreated from the room, then reappeared a few moments later with a notary seal and a few more pages for me to sign. When that was done, she gathered everything together, accepted the cashier's check, and left us in the room again for several minutes. It's not very dramatic, Tabitha sighed. Buying a big house like this should be more like an adventure, Sybil suggested. This is very dull. Yeah, well, that's how things are in New Jersey, I said. Except at Whole Foods, Tabitha laughed. That was not typical, as you well know, I replied with a grin. Here you are, Mr. Baker, the assistant said as she returned with a thick brown envelope and a small white envelope. Your copy of the documents are in here, and these are the keys to your new house. There's also a remote for the gate in the garage. Congratulations. Thank you, I replied as I accepted both envelopes. The assistant nodded and then stepped aside so we could return to the waiting area. She waved as we stepped into the cool autumn air again, though I saw her collapse into her chair behind the desk with a sigh when she thought we were gone. So, who wants to see the new house? I asked as I pulled out of the lot. You know damn well we do, Sybil replied. To the house, Tabitha added. Who was I to argue?